if we just sort of go through briefly, what is strategic innovation? I'm not going to labour on definitions, but just give you a flavour for what I believe that to be. An understanding of why that's an essential part of the overall innovation mix. There are many, many forms of innovation. In fact, there are probably countless forms depending on how you look at it. This is a particular take on it. I'm not saying it's the be-all and end-all, I'm saying it's relevant for particular situations, but there are many others. When I was asked to speak, I was asked to give a word on the issue of reframing issues, which is actually a very difficult thing to talk about. It's very interesting, but it's actually difficult to explain, but I'll do the best I can and then try and bring this to life through a few experiences. So this is my definition rather than an official one. Strategic innovation is all about reimagining and innovating the strategy itself. So often when we talk about innovation, our mind immediately turns to the technology, the process, the product, etc. That's all really, really important. But when we're talking about strategic innovation, it's really around reconceiving the very strategy of the organisation, how we create value, who we serve, all those sorts of higher order questions. So just to bring that to life a little bit, strategic innovation would be the kind of thinking that would sit behind something like iTunes, for example, which was basically reinventing a category, or sitting behind a Richard Branson when he thinks about, okay, where are places where consumers are not getting enough value and how can I enter that and shape and change that market? There's an interesting quote I like from Rowan Gibson, who said, "Perpetual growth requires perpetual renewal. It's the only way to maintain continuity in a discontinuous world. And the fuel for renewal is innovation. Not merely innovation at the margins, but deep strategic innovation at the level of the core business model." And so it's not a bad quote, I think, to sort of capture the essence of this space. So the way I think about it, these are some of the key characteristics when we're talking about strategic innovation. It takes the views that an industry structure or a market is dynamic. The edges of it are changing all the time. It's not static. It recognises the value of anticipating and shaping that future environment, not just reacting to it. And it tends to be, not always, but tends to be more future back. So it's more actually anticipating the way things will be or should be, and designing backwards from that is a common sort of direction in strategic innovation. And tends to be very iterative, because there's no way to predict that future. You have to sort of get messy as well and get involved and try things and prototype and shape as you go. And you can imagine that in a lot of the examples I've just given. And challenges any business to think beyond its existing business boundaries. It's not limited to technologies, etc., although usually involves those things. It usually takes longer to do. It's usually much harder to do. It usually has much higher risk. But if you're in a category where there are disruptive changes occurring, discontinuities coming in, then you have to do this. You have to do this just to remain relevant. And I guess the other thing about strategic innovation is it's not an either or. It's not something you do instead of product innovation or what have you. You need to do both at once. Looking after today's business while simultaneously building the future. So in the context of my World Vision role, that's exactly how we've split it. So we've created an innovation program for the staff where they can, in their particular area, whether it's fundraising or work in the field, they are equipped with tools, resources, etc. to innovate on the job, present forward mostly. The stream that I lead, we've actually created a separate stream that sits on a sort of a semi-independent basis to the main organisation, and our job is to actually go right out into the future and understand what development's going to look like, how will people be lifted out of poverty in future, understand those key trends, and then look for opportunities to incubate and learn how to do that. And I'll give you a few examples a little bit later. All right, so I think everyone here is probably familiar with the 9-dot puzzle. Has everyone done this at some point? Once you've done it, it looks so easy. It's so easy, but if you haven't done it before, it's difficult. And this is the origin, as I understand it, of the term thinking outside the box. think it's from the 1960s or 70s when management consultants started trying to encourage business to think outside the box. So the problem here, or the task here, is to link all 9 dots using 4 straight lines or fewer without lifting the pen and without tracing back. And so, of course, it's actually, first of all, has anyone not done it before? Okay, all right, a couple. So have a think about mentally how you might do that. It's not easy. The actual answer looks a little bit like this. And so there's your 4 straight lines that you've sort of obeyed the rules, as it were. But in order to do that, you had to go outside the array that was there. And of course, what happens is that mentally, people draw lines around the outside of the array. So mentally, we just assume that. But it's that assumption that prevents you from solving the problem. So in essence, that's essentially the simplest way I can find to describe strategic innovation. It's actually thinking outside the apparent conventions or boundaries of a problem to come at it from a different angle. So this, of course, gives you a much bigger field in which to play, and new options open up outside those which are immediately apparent. Does that make sense to everyone? Yep, great. All right, so why then is strategic innovation a really important part of the overall innovation picture? Given the nature of what your department does, I thought I'd try and draw on economics. I'm not an economist, and I'm aware that I think the last time I presented an economic concept, Philip shot me down afterwards and said that wasn't quite right. In a friendly way, I would say. I love this. There's an old joke amongst American economists where they say that if you ask 5 economists, you'll get 5 different opinions, 6 if one went to Harvard. And so what I'm going to put forward here is actually a Stanford point of view. So last year, my team and I just remotely did a Stanford course on strategic innovation and design thinking. So we looked at that methodology, the Stanford methodology, and thought that would be a good one to sheep dip our team in, because it actually has a lot of relevance to what we're trying to do at World Vision. So I'll give you a few slides from that course. So it's their fault, not mine, if you don't agree with it. But I think it was quite useful, at least for me at the time, in putting into context why strategic innovation is so very important at the moment. So their view was, this chart here, if you can't see the timeline, runs from 88 to 2007 when the slides were published. And their takeout here was that there was this fairly steady global economic boom, and there was a period of steady growth that went with it. They saw the key drivers of that being technology-based productivity, relative geopolitical harmony, which I assume is end of the Cold War they might be referring to, increasing global access to markets, relatively low cost of capital. So their view was, in this period, it was a reasonably formulaic growth strategy. So if you just do A, B and C right, you should be able to grow, to paraphrase. Then it went into the 1990s, into the bubble years, and that was the beginning of this whole period, I suppose, of irrational exuberance. Ironically, within that, most of our clients were actually big corporates doing very sensible things, but of course there was the whole dot-com thing that sort of sat around that. But anyway, you had this sort of internet-based revolution and things going absolutely crazy. And the job that took me out of Adelaide eventually was I was headhunted by Anderson's to start their internet practice. So it was a very, very interesting time. Many of our clients were sort of 23-year-olds who'd just been given $25 million to go and build something that had no chance of success. So it was a very interesting time. Well, actually, I nearly got the sack because one time that was literally the case. There were 3 23, 24-year-olds. They had, I think these guys had $15 million they were given. They took me through their business model, and I said to them, and they actually wanted to outsource the lot to us, all the development, everything, and which is a huge client in consulting terms. And I said to them over a number of weeks, guys, I don't think your business model is going to work. I can't in good conscience, do this with you unless we work together to change your business model. and they went and complained to the managing partner, and he raked me over the coals. So it was quite interesting. That was a very large consulting client to turn down, but someone had to inject some sanity into that particular conversation. So very interesting times. Of course, followed by the inevitable result. Well, yeah, I think about, if I'm not mistaken, about 6 or 9 months later, they'd sort of lost all support, because I think they ran into others who were saying the same sort of thing. Yep. So here we have that sort of when that bubble burst, and there were plenty of other stories like that, of course. This disillusionment. I'm not sure what geopolitical events means. I don't recall from that time, but the financial scandals, the Enrons, etc. You know exactly what happened. So Stanford's view is that really, during that period, is really about a survival strategy, like not falling into a great big hole. So this is their view of where we are now, just keeping in mind that the slides were written in 2008. Their view is that now what businesses are trying to do is free up cash, become more flexible, and trying desperately to differentiate. Not sure whether you sort of broadly concur with this, but my interpretation of that would be recognition that the pace of change has increased rapidly. The prospect of disruption is forever there. It's accelerating and can occur much faster than before. As a result of that, companies know they need to be more flexible and nimble, so that's why they're freeing up the cash. Companies increasingly seeing themselves as being players within networks and ecosystems, which is actually quite a different way of thinking about your business from perhaps 10, 15 years ago. They're partnering with others more on their non-core activities, choosing to specialise, increasing awareness that they're really a part of a global economy, not a local or a national one in many cases. Increasing awareness that you have to perform at world-class levels, because if you're not facing world competition or international competition right now, it's probably not long before you will be. And that their opportunities and threats are increasingly going to come from other markets. This is Apple and Microsoft. So it's quite interesting. They were very, very similar for a long period of time. But in those early 90s, Microsoft started to pull away. And even though Apple was probably the far better organisation in terms of innovation, it was really at that product or design level, perhaps. And Microsoft, despite not being as good at that, were really pulling away, perhaps because they were better at business model innovation. The second chart there is looking at 2001 to 2007, and this is comparing Apple and Sony. And it's quite interesting. Again, they're very similar for a long period of time until Apple started pulling away, and the delta is absolutely massive there. And it was really around the time of iTunes, which is essentially when Apple made the switch from product-based design or innovation to business model innovation. So I've also updated this a little bit. So I've got the most recent version to map Apple and Sony over a longer period of time through to today. You can see they're actually keeping this up. So you've got iTunes back here, but that's now iPhone, App Store, iPad, iCloud, all these sorts of things. And that, of course, is where the vast majority of their value is being created. This is an interesting chart for me, because in my earlier years back here, I had Sony as a client and I had Hutchison Telecom as a client. So Sony was very interesting. Back here, it was around advising them on this new business model they wanted to introduce, where devices could talk wirelessly amongst each other in the days when that was a freaky idea. And they never really progressed very far with that, or at least they were quite late with that. And then in this period here, I've forgotten what year that was, I was engaged by Hutchison Telecom to do some visioning work with them around the future of mobile data and where that was going to go, again, the very early days of that. It's quite interesting, because I remember at the time posing different what-if situations to them to broaden their thinking and get them to open up their minds a little bit. And I posed specifically the question of Apple. What if Apple created a phone and entered your market? And even these guys, who were very innovative, actually sort of scoffed at the idea and thought, well, even if they tried, we'd kill them, you know. And then, that's right, the year after that, iPhone, and the rest is history. So I guess the key with these things is to never, ever, ever get locked into thinking the industry will always be like this, or if you want to succeed, here's the 3 things you've got to do. Now, I do appreciate that there are some enduring economic principles that sit underneath this, but the way in which you go about doing that, it's death, essentially, in this emerging business world, to get too conventional about where the boundaries are and who could possibly ever compete with you, and in fact what the rules of competition are. So a quote I really like from Gary Hamel, who's really one of the early proponents of all of this. This is an early quote, but I do like it. He says, "Never forget that sunken good companies are simply those who denied reality and their strategic deterioration for too long. When you discover you're on a dead horse, the best strategy is to dismount. Of course, there are other strategies. You can change riders, you can get a committee to study the dead horse, you can benchmark how other companies ride dead horses, you can declare that it's cheaper to feed a dead horse, you can harness several dead horses together, but after you've tried all these things, you're still going to have to dismount." I think that captures it fairly succinctly. All right, so just a few words now on reframing. So a key part of strategic innovation is actually seeing the opportunity in a new light, and essentially what reframing is about. A thought that I think captures this quite well is Archimedes' quote of the principle or the metaphor of a lever. Give me a place to stand, a lever long enough, and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world. Essentially, that principle can be applied to the idea of strategic innovation. So, for the purpose of this conversation, if we say, well, let's say the world in this metaphor is the economic, industry, business, social challenges and opportunities that South Australia faces, which is really about identifying the need. A place on which to stand is really about finding a point outside the problem from which you can get that fresh perspective on the objective and be much more holistic about your approach. And this is really the framing bit, which I'll come back to in just a tick. The fulcrum, in my mind, in this metaphor, is really about the critical point at which the whole system turns. The right placement's essential if you're going to get the mechanical advantage that you're looking for. And for me, in the work I do, this is very much around getting the deep, usually human insight into how people behave, what they want, where they're going, how they make decisions, etc. And the lever is the particular instrument one wants to use, whether it's a technology or policy, whatever that might be, and making sure that's sort of sufficient for the job. And I suppose in a sense that's the actual tangible innovation. There's actually a lot of thinking to be done before you get there. So Einstein had this to say, I think slight exaggeration, but again the principle's right. If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended upon the solution, I'd spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I knew the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. Now again, the time frames are probably an exaggeration, but I would have to say over the 15 odd years that I've done consulting work, I probably started off spending 5% of the engagement on defining the problem and 95% running around ideas doing analysis, to something like maybe 40% or even 50%, which sounds excessive, I know, but every experience I've had where a client's been really happy with something that I've done, it's always been that response where they say, I'd never looked at it that way before. It's a very common response from a happy client. And much of the value actually came from how you framed the problem. It sounds like a very arrogant consulting thing to say, and it is, no excuse, but there are very few clients I've worked with who I think were right in how they defined the problem. And when I say that, it's not just my opinion versus theirs. I mean, once we got to the point of agreement where we both agreed on what the problem was, I'd say in 90% plus cases, it was quite a different framing of the actual problem or opportunity to the way they might have defined it in the first place. And that's just because you can be very close to the problem. So even now in my current role in World Vision, I will often get people outside of the organisation to come and test me and challenge me and help me see it differently. So I'm not saying this is some special skill of mine, I'm just saying it's a problem for anyone who's very close to the problem. Very, very important to be getting these fresh perspectives all the time. So essentially, framing is, if you think of it in these terms, the battleground is really about the mental models that we have, those constructs in our mind of the way the world works. Those shorthand things to say, right, essentially, I've seen this before, 1, 2, 3, that's what you need to do. The main opposition here is conventional wisdom or industry orthodoxy. So interesting thing, when we did the Stanford course last year, they identified the most common barriers to strategic innovation. Number one was expert opinion in their view. Very, very interesting thought. And I guess not to say that you don't need expert opinion, you do, but if you're immediately jumping to what does this authoritative person say without questioning that or without involving that person with other people from other backgrounds, that seems to be, because of the whole idea of a mental model, it seems to be you go straight to that and then you find it very hard to break out of that thinking. So the basis of strategy here is trying to find the most illuminating way of looking at the problem. You're looking for that fresh perspective, you're trying to challenge the assumptions, you're trying to challenge where you can the traditional trade-offs that you might have to make in that situation. And the benefit of reframing is, as we saw with the 9-dot problem, it just opens up your options. It doesn't mean to say you have to choose those options, but at least you've got more to play with. Okay, so if you think about this like a photographer, not that I am, essentially if you're a photographer, you're standing outside the object. I'm a very visual thinker, so even when I'm dealing with a particular client challenge or a particular problem we're trying to solve at World Vision, I actually literally think of it like a 3D object floating up here, and I sort of walk around it, if you like, in my mind and try and probe it from different angles and try and get as many perspectives on that particular challenge as I can. Try and suspend judgment for as long as possible on what the actual problem is or the angle we need to come at it from, and test as many as we can. So with something like this, you need to stand back far enough away from the problem that you can see it in its totality, if you like, the system in which the problem sits. But you've also got to be close enough that you can get some of the richness, understand some of the complexities of that problem, the human truth of the problem, if you will, and then find the angle that allows the best insight. So a photographer would think about, okay, why am I even taking this image? And I think one of the biggest questions people never ask is, why do I need to innovate? They jump straight to, what do I need to innovate, or how do I do it? Not enough questioning of why you even need to do that, because once you understand that, you've actually got a lot of the answers. They would think about, okay, what lens to use, how far back to stand, how far do I zoom in, what object should be in the frame or outside the frame, how much information is needed inside that image to communicate what I'm trying to, the best angle, the best light, etc. And in many ways, that analogy is quite useful for understanding strategic framing. I did an engagement in London I spent a couple of days in London with a really lovely guy who is recently retired colonel from the US Army, and he ran the Army and Marines counterinsurgency strategy centre. So he was an expert in that and had served in Afghanistan and Iraq, etc. A very, very articulate man, very highly educated, but also very experienced on the ground. And he used this wonderful expression that I've adopted ever since, that when he's thinking about a complex problem like that, he thinks of it in terms of gaining holographic insight, is the term that he used. And I really, really like that metaphor, because it's sort of, there's a certain transparency. There's 3D, but it's also transparent, and it sort of, it's like you're walking around inside the problem, testing it, as it were, and trying to understand it's not just a military solution, it's not just an aid solution, it's not just a governance one, it's actually all of those things coming together. Are you familiar with the Harvard article called Marketing Myopia? Okay. All right, if you're a marketer, you must have heard of this one, but not many are. This is an article from Harvard Business Review from 1960. It's very famous in marketing circles, and by Theodore Levitt. And the example he used, which people quote, is that he's talking about the railroads at the time in America. He was saying the railroads are essentially going out of business, at that time at least, not because there wasn't a need for transport or for people to move goods or whatever, but because those companies defined themselves as being in the railroad business rather than the transportation business. So if you can understand, it's the same but it's different. And defining your business differently opens up a whole range of new insight around how you're actually going to play and connect with others. Another brief example would be selling refrigerators in India. So there was a Korean white goods company looking to enter the Indian market. CEO sent his team out there and said, go and tell me if we can enter the Indian market. His team came back and said, no, we can't, the time's not right because there are no profitable segments that we can find. And the CEO turned around and said to them, there's no such thing as an unprofitable segment, only an unprofitable product. Now go back to India and work out a product that would be profitable for that market. So it's a very simple reframing, but again they did, and now they're very successful in that market. Another example very briefly would be in World Vision's case and a lot of other international development NGOs, probably not by intention, but perhaps fell into it, for in the earlier years really took effectively what you call a deficit-based approach to poor communities. So you go in, you look at a community or a slum or whatever it might be, and you look at all the things they haven't got, and then you start thinking about, okay, well, how do we fill these gaps? And that's a natural enough way to think about it, of course. But there's a lot of work has gone into it and a lot of research been done to suggest that a strength-based or an asset-based lens on those communities, some of my colleagues say it's 3 or 4 times more effective in terms of the outcomes. So actually going into these communities, they might be living in abject poverty, and instead of just focusing or immediately focusing on the deficits, focus on what they do have. What strengths have they got? What skills? What geographic location? Is there a river nearby? Is there a market up the river? All those sorts of things. And even though it might be very small, working with those and their ability to change human behaviour, to get early traction, all those, and not create dependence, all those sorts of things is much, much higher. And all it is, it's the same project, but it's just a reframing of how we might approach it. So simple examples of reframing and how they might help. I'll give you a couple of examples. Again, there are many. The ones I've picked, just to be a little bit different, are mostly social in nature, but there are plenty of commercial ones as well. Just to give you a flavour of how this sort of stuff works in practice, at least in my experience. So as Gavin mentioned, just recently, a colleague and I were asked to run an innovation workshop over 2 days in the UN. It was one of the most difficult things I've done ever. Very complex environment, but very, very interesting. Essentially, it was around humanitarian innovation. So every year, the thought leaders, there's about 80 of them, get together and they think about the future of the humanitarian space. And generally speaking, you would say that these people had never, the idea that there is a humanitarian sector is actually almost foreign to them, whereas these people live and breathe the humanitarian sector. So they need to put a structure around their space so that they can collaborate and do the things they need to do. These guys weren't really all that aware of one. They just got on with what they needed to do in the context of their particular area. And so it was very interesting. For the first day, I think those 2 cohorts were largely talking past each other, vaguely recognising what the other was saying, but not really connecting with it. But over the course of the 2 days, they were coming together and just firing. And this really opened up people's minds to a whole set of new possibilities, because somebody else was using a different metaphor or a different language, and the way they put it suddenly turned some lights on here. And they're both learning from each other. The young guys are learning from the experienced ones and saying, oh, the way you've just expressed that has made it so clear to me. I've been struggling with this, and now you've put words to it that now mean something and open up something to me. And the other way, the French have this wonderful saying that I quite like, where it's all very well in practice, but it will never work in theory. Is that the right? I've got it right, haven't I? Yeah. And so these guys are doing things that are very effective, and these guys are saying, whoa, hang on a minute, that challenges the boundaries of my theory and the way I've always thought about things. And so it's a wonderful exchange to be a part of. Very quickly, you won't be able to read this. This is a piece I'm doing with World Vision at the moment, where we are trying to anticipate what does development look like in the year 2025. And there's piles and piles and piles of research from the World Bank and what have you about all these shifts that are going to go on in the world, from climate change to China to technology and what have you. But there's so much stuff out there that we actually find it very hard to make decisions on it. So we have a project that's going through and synthesising all of these things, and we found a way of finding 21 trends that if you understand these 21, you effectively understand 80% of the change that's likely to occur, and it makes it much, much easier for us to identify whether we're going in the right direction, what new innovations we might need to think about, etc. I'll give you two very quick examples here. So one is, this is the proportion of people who are poor, who are living in urban slums. So right now, we're over here, I think about 85% of World Vision's programs are in rural areas. We're creeping up to there being 50-50 split between rural and urban slums. And if you look at the trajectory there, it's absolutely huge. And the nature of development is very different, generally speaking, in urban environments. And so just understanding this, which is one of those boxes up there with a whole bunch of data sitting behind it, sends out a signal we need to innovate urgently around this particular issue. And we're looking at quite a range of new business models to do that. Another example, just very quickly, would be mobile phone penetration amongst the poor. So at the moment there's 7 billion people in the world, 6 billion have a mobile. Even in developing countries the penetration's 79%, but of those only 10% have a bank account and only 1 in 8 have internet access at the moment. So you do go to these countries and see lots of mobile phones, but they're the clunky old Nokias, that, you know, analog phones. But by the year 2025 that will be near universal. That would be the equivalent, you would imagine, of a 4G phone or something like that with all the bits and pieces, and probably cost $5 at that stage and be very cheap. But in that future, it's not just about mobile phones, of course. In that future, well, in this world, you've got organisations, governments, etc., dealing with people, the poor, at a community level or a regional level. In that future, they'll all be individually identifiable. You'll be able to communicate with all of them. The mobile phone will act as their bank account, so your ability to do microfinance loans or cash transfers in an emergency, all those sorts of things can be quite direct. And so the impact on the development value chain is likely to be massive, because a central government or a large NGO could skip over many smaller players and just deliver development services directly. The child maternal health plans could be specific to your family and your family's needs, conditions, etc. So it's something like that is radically changing how development is going to happen. So in our case, strategic innovation is about understanding or anticipating these sorts of things. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like in 2025, but we know enough to know we have got to be playing around in this future right now and learning how to do this and mainstreaming it over time.